Unfortunately, the world outside of my home was not as accepting. I mean, I've gotten sworn at on the street more times than I can count, simply because of how I walk or how I talk or how I carry myself. It very much turned me into a person who can find a way to fit into almost any circumstance, almost any situation. At no point did anybody tell me, like, hey, this is a need that exists and one that you could legitimately specialize in. One of them told me a story about when he had to pull a gun on somebody. I just wanted to sit down and do nothing forever. And I was like, do nothing? He was like, no, I wanted to cry.
Have you ever wondered what masculinity even is in the modern era? Are you ready to move beyond the macho bully or the soy boy archetypes? I'm Marc Azoulay, and this is the Men's Therapy Podcast. Together, we'll explore how neuroscience, Jungian psychology, and Buddhist philosophy can transform your life, your marriage, and your business. Are you ready to deep dive into the minds of men? Let's begin. Hello, and welcome back to the Men's Therapy Podcast. I'm here with Mauricio Verduzco, and he is a therapist that I just met at the Colorado Counseling Association conference. And he just moved he's new to Colorado, and he works for the Tree of Life Counseling Center. They help people of marginalized backgrounds, especially men, that kind of tend to not go to therapy. And he has a nonprofit called The Root of Life, which essentially is helping people that don't have access to supervision in our field get supervision. What I like about Mauricio is that he did a presentation on machismo. So I'd love to dive into that with you during our conversation today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Marc. Happy to be here.
So we always like to kick the show off with kind of personal stories. So I'm curious, like, what was your experience with masculinity growing up? Did you feel like you fit in or not? And how did it develop over the course of the years? So yeah, go, life story.
I don't know how to get started. I never quite felt like I fit in for various reasons. You know, my family moved around a lot when I was growing up. Before I landed in Austin, Texas, which is where I studied and got my license as a therapist. Before I landed there in 2007-ish, I had lived in like 17 different cities. So we just kind of bounced around a lot between the US and Mexico, back and forth. Me looking the way I do, kind of, wide appearing, I used to have a very thick accent, and I had to do away with that because like this face with a thick accent just kind of produced a lot of questions that I didn't feel like answering.
Fair.
And honestly, the examples I had of masculinity and home were very healthy ones. My dad was not a man's man. He has a lot of like very traditionally masculine hobbies, but he was fine with me just kind of doing whatever I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And when I was growing up, I did some theater. I played like Magic the Gathering. I didn't do any sports. I didn't do any of that. So I was just kind of allowed to express my masculinity in however I felt I needed to.
Okay.
And that was wonderful. Unfortunately, the world outside of my home was not as accepting.
Okay.
We've met in person. I present relatively theatrically, I like to say. I'm quite flamboyant in my personality and in my speech. And that, people make assumptions. People will absolutely, I've gotten sworn at on the street more times than I can count, simply because of how I walk or how I talk or how I carry myself.
Yeah.
I'll admit though, it hasn't happened in a long time. So I hopefully that means that things are changing. But yeah, that was kind of how I grew up experiencing masculinity.
Yeah.
The people closest. I'm sorry?
Oh no, I was curious, like between Mexico and US, like what was that experience? You said that you grew up kind of both places in two different cultures. Yeah, can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. That was that had its challenges, but also its benefits.
Yeah.
It very much turned me into a person who can find a way to fit into almost any circumstance, almost any situation. Um, when I was a teenager, that's a time when a lot of us kind of struggle to find ourselves and who we're going to be, developing a sense of identity. What I found during my adolescence was that I kind of needed to stamp down my identity. You know, I had my years in Mexico. Uh, I was kind of weird for being nerdy, being a little theatrical.
That's
I
it.
didn't necessarily get made fun of a lot for it, but I was that kind of like ostracized. Like my groups of friends were los raros, the weird ones.
That's it.
And then when I came to the U.S., my nerdy hobbies were much more accepted, like the fact that I played Magic the Gathering and D&D. That didn't seem to be as much of a problem, but the fact that I was, flamboyant was suddenly a huge issue. Um, so culturally speaking, I never really felt like I fit in anywhere, so I kept having to
Yeah.
mold myself to fit into whatever situation I was in. I no longer do that, thankfully. I'm much more confident and comfortable in my authentic self, and I can approach situations like that. But the culture difference was pretty wild.
It is.
Um, if we're focusing more specifically on like the culture difference in terms of masculinity, was also pretty strange
With it.
because the city that I was in during my adolescence in Mexico was Guadalajara, which is a city in central Mexico. It's a very large city, and in Mexico, bigger cities kind of behave a little bit more like what you might see culturally speaking in the northeast of the United States, like more metropolitan,
Sure.
more less country, if you will. And then when I was in the US, I was mostly living in southern states, so Texas, Florida, New Mexico,
Mhm.
where it was very, good old boy country. Um, and in Mexico, in the bigger cities, masculinity was much more. Oh, they had a term for it back then. Metrosexual.
Is it?
It was what like
Yeah, yeah.
so so like the more masculine guys were guys, with really well neat and done hair, and their button up shirts were done like quite nice, and they took a lot of they put a lot of time and attention to their like appearance. It was relatively normal for dudes to have like manicured hands. That was perfectly normal. Um, and then comes Texas, very different expressions of masculinity,
With it.
where the more masculine guys are the ones who don't appear to put as much effort into the appearance. Like, it's like t-shirt and jeans. Back then, torn up jeans were all the rage, so that's
Yeah.
what most people were wearing. The particular high school that I went to, uh, like seeing somebody with muddied up boots was usually more of a status symbol.
That's it. Yeah.
So it was very different cultures going from one to the next.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's interesting that you like found your own way in each of them. Yeah, because when I think of stereotypes around Latin culture, like like you said, the more flamboyant, just more color, right? Like just
Hmm.
people dressing with more color, having more emotion, right? Having more expression. I think of like dance culture that's there and how like
Oh yeah,
wonderful that is, right?
yeah.
And how, yeah, and in like Texas, like it's none of that, right? I mean, it's like you wear like simple colors, you're wearing simple clothes, like you're not
Hmm.
like emotional, right? I imagine it's very like gruff and stoic. I guess that maybe
Yes.
there's like hoedowns, I don't know, like square dance, but it's not the same as like Latin dance, which is just such like
No.
a wonderful art. Yeah.
Mhm. And it's interesting you mentioned that. So um, I actually didn't even learn to dance until I was an adult. Um, but like dance clubs in Mexico,
Mhm.
it's a lot of younger people going there for dancing.
That's what.
Um, and in Texas, at least when I was an adolescent, if you went to a dance club, it was usually a two-stepping place, and it was also a lot of young people, but it was mostly the guys there were usually older. Like I remember when I was learning to two-step, um, it was like women of all ages, a few young guys, but then a bunch of like older dudes who had been two-stepping for years and were just excellent at it.
Yeah.
But not a lot of younger guys into two-stepping. So I don't know if that was a result of like, differences in how we express masculinity, where, in Mexico, like if you dance beautifully, it can still be a wonderful expression of masculinity. But as a younger guy dancing in the States, maybe not so much. Um, I do know that at least today, there is a much larger dance scene in Austin, Texas. At least there's a huge dance scene now of people of all ages. So I'm hoping that just means that things are changing.
That yeah, it's coming back, right? And the definitions are
Hmm.
widening a little bit. Okay, yeah. So let's continue with your story, right? So you're kind of like raised between two cultures, right? Between two worlds. You have like both your messages and kind of nerd culture, which I think is, at least in my experience, also being from nerd culture. When we grew up, it was like online. It really didn't have geography in a way. You
Hmm.
know, it was a lot of just like, I remember speaking with people all over the world about the hobbies that I shared because I didn't have them in my own personal community. I grew up in like rural Maryland, so magic cards were not that popular, but I liked them. So it was
Yeah.
good to like play with people online and things like that. So you kind of have these three different cultures. So how do you decide to get into the world of therapy and personal work?
So, oh man, this is I, for various reasons that may be a little obvious at this point, grew up as a very angry teenager,
Really?
like very angry. Um, and although in the home, I was encouraged to talk things out, to be honest, to do all that whatnot. When you're a teenager, rebelling against your parents is pretty normal. So my rebellion against my parents was, I'm not going to talk about it. I'm just going to get mad, and sometimes that resulted in physical fights. Um, and I remember just being angry and getting into fights and all that. And it was in the U.S. I was in high school in Austin, Texas, when I got into a fight with a student over, I'm sure, something incredibly not worth fighting over.
Oh, what was it? Yeah.
I know. And one of the counselors from the school just kind of like pulled me aside and talked to me in a way that I had never been talked to by an adult. Um, he told me, I could see you're angry, and you're perfectly valid. Like he just told me that like you're perfectly right to be angry,
Really?
but it's not okay to use that anger in the way you're using it. And that had really been the first time I had ever felt like my anger validated.
Yes.
Um, even even in my home, my family being as emotionally accepting as they were, in Mexico, at least in the parts where I was growing up in, there was a big culture of like, no te enojes, el que se enoja pierde. Don't get angry. If you get angry, you lose. Where, at least as a child, as an adult, there's different rules, but as a child, you're told, don't be angry. You're not asked why you're angry. The idea of like exploring the anger doesn't exist. It's more just don't be angry, be obedient. And this counselor in the high school I was at was like really the first time that somebody A validated my experience of anger, and B kind of explored it with me. So that started like my whole idea into psychology. Uh, Through a very strange chain of events, I eventually became. I kind of like gave up on psychology for a while, and I became a probation officer. That
Really?
Yeah, I was a probation officer
Wild.
for almost 2 years.
Yeah.
Um, and
Okay.
it was a horrifying experience. Um, I was terrible at it. Like, to be honest, I got fired. I was terrible at it. Um, I was told I had a caseload of like 450
Yeah.
people on probation that I had to monitor, and I was told, oh, don't take more than 10 minutes per person, because And I was like, but I have so many questions I need to ask them about like how they're doing and if there's ways that I can help with this whole community. So I just went in with a different mentality. But while I was there, I met some therapists that were hired by the county probation
Mhm.
to do cognitive behavioral therapy groups. And I got to sit in on some of the groups. I got to hang out with the therapists. The lead guy was like, "Dude, you should go back to school and like try out this therapy thing. You seem to have uh, I don't remember what he called it, but like he's like, you seem to have a knack for it."
Amen.
And I got to see there's three different people who are on my caseload for probation. I got to see them go through some pretty excellent changes in their mindsets about how they approach the world, how they approach themselves, and really see the effect that somebody who's ready to do the work of counseling, like somebody who's ready to change. And as soon as I got fired, I was like, well, I got nothing else going on. Guess I'll go back to school.
Yeah, I'm smiling because my first job out of grad school was working for probation as a therapist. I was one of those dudes.
Nice.
I was doing like DUI education and therapy groups
Hmm.
essentially, and like relapse prevention groups for people that were in Boulder County. So that's really interesting that we have that in common that we were on like both sides of the coin there.
It was a fun enough experience, but like I realized it wasn't for me.
Yeah,
I would have liked to do the therapist part because they, from what they told me, they didn't have to arrest anybody because they couldn't pay their probation fees, and I had to do that more times than what my little soul could take.
Great.
yeah, that's true. Did not have to arrest anybody. It did have to like M1 hold is what it is in Colorado, like call the cops a few times,
Sure.
and go to the jail a few times, which was tough for me.
Yeah.
I'm also like sensitive. Like I couldn't like I burned out hard on that job because my job was like going to jail, and I was like, shit, man. Like I got a job to not go to jail. And, like, I'm like in the jail, and it's Boulder County, which is like probably one of the nicer jails in the country, but it's an impressive environment. I mean, it's like really, really drab in there.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. It's I had to go to the jail a few times, and I was like, I've never seen an institution better suited to strip someone of their humanity
yeah.
than what I saw in those jails in Travis County. Um, Miles ahead of what I saw when I was working in the juvie. Like working in juvie just did not prepare me for working in an adult jail.
Mhm. Yeah, it's wild. But anyway, so you did the jail for a while, right? You went back to school to be a therapist. Do you want to focus on working on men at that point, or did something change? Because I imagine you're working with a lot of guys in the prison system, but
Hmm.
I'm wondering, yeah, was that a focus going into your education that you wanted to really narrow down?
Full on. Didn't even know that was an option.
Yeah.
Like at no point did anybody tell me like, hey, this is a need that exists and one that you could legitimately specialize in. And when I was in school, you I did a lot of work with professors, and most of the professors knew my story because when you're in school for counseling, you wind up telling your story a bunch of different times. Nobody ever mentioned anything like, "Hey, maybe working with men or men's health issues is a thing for you."
Yeah.
I graduated with I graduated from the counseling program fully convinced I was going to work with juvenile justice and sexual health.
Okay. Yeah.
I still do that work. I'm working with the Sexual Health Alliance. At some point, I'm going to get my certified sex therapist certification thing set. I still sometimes do work with underage people who are going through the juvenile justice system. Um, I haven't in a while, just because I haven't had that contract in a while.
Yeah.
But at no point did anybody say like, "Have you considered working with men's health?" And that honestly didn't happen until, man, I don't even know. I want to say honestly, possibly sometime during the pandemic, um, when when I was meeting with another professional, another counselor from a different state. We had just kind of coincided in some stuff, and she asked me if I'd ever read The Will to Change by Bell Hooks.
Right.
And I hadn't. I hadn't even ever heard of it. And that, like, when I finally got my hands on it, that's kind of what led me to really looking into the concepts of like masculinity, the concepts of how harmful it is. I had seen it. I had just never had the words to. I never had the verbiage to express it. Um, I worked briefly in they called it EMCOT, which is the Mobile Crisis Outreach Team, and cops show up when there's crisis. So I worked with a lot of cops. I never got to like actually have one as a client, but in sometimes those like moments when it was just like me and the cop talking, I would get them talking, and they would start like talking about some of the difficulties of being a police officer. Um, I know that there are a lot of problems with the police, and I'm not going to touch on I'm not going to touch on any of it. I'd rather just like focusing on individual cop. One of them told me a story about how when he had to pull a gun on somebody because of whatever reasons, cops have to pull guns on people. He went back to the station and had to pretend that everything was okay. And he was like, "Man, I just wanted to sit down and do nothing forever." And I was like, "Do nothing?" He was like, "No, I wanted to cry." I was like, "Yeah." And how he just had to hide that from all of his colleagues because if any of them found out, he was afraid they would think less of him.
Right. He'd be
So,
ostracized for having like a totally human reaction.
yeah,
Yeah.
not just ostracized. His fear was that people wouldn't want him covering their back, like because like, oh, he's going to crack under pressure or whatever. And he was concerned that if people found out, that they wouldn't have his back. We're like, let him learn. He's got to toughen up or whatever.
Yeah.
I think that was the word that he used. He's got to, and I was just like, I had all these experiences of masculinity taken to the point where it's harmful to the self and to others. I did not have the words or the capacity to express it as like, hey, this toxic masculinity is indeed toxic, and it is something that maybe we should be addressing on a social level.
Yeah. It is wild how we had a similar experience where like it wasn't talked about at all at my grad school. And in fact, it was like looking back, it was almost shunned. Whenever people would try to bring things up around that, we wouldn't have the space to talk about it. I think it was when I was coming up, it was a lot of like gender studies, but not men's studies, right? It was like women, DEI, which is all super important, of course, but like there wasn't room to talk about men and mental health, without being like demonized or shunned or pushed out, which is crazy because it's like half the population. And, I think we both share this idea of like men don't go to mental health treatment. And I think our industry really needs to step up and figure out how to get them into mental health treatment because we need it just as much as everyone else.
Of course.
We're just too busy being tough and being brainwashed by our cultures to think we need that.
Yeah. Like, no, that's for women and children. That's not for men. Men are self-reliant. And I was like, well, sure. It doesn't mean you can't ask for help when help is necessary.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like, it's just true with real problems. I don't have a real problem. I'm just,
Oh, yeah.
I'm just a dude, right? I think there's a lot of minimization that happens.
Mm-hmm. That's a big one. It's also really big in the Latino community. Like minimizing problems, thinking that therapy is for crazy people.
Yeah.
And fun thing. If I had that conversation with a lot of, unfortunately, my extended family or friends who, stayed over there, and they would be like, "Oh, so you work with a bunch of crazy people?" I was like, "Well, no, I'm a therapist. I work with whoever feels they're going to benefit from therapy." And then it'd be like, "Yeah, crazy people." Like, okay, quick exercise.
Yeah.
What is a crazy person? And they'd have no idea. They would be like, "Well, I guess people who hallucinate. Okay, sure, people who hallucinate. There's oddly not a lot the therapist can do if you're hallucinating. It's usually why medication's important. And I was like, but who else? Who else? I was like, oh, I guess people who, people who, what one guy told me, how do you phrase it? People who can't get up in the morning to go to work. And I was like, it's a very specific example. Can you think of somebody who does that? He was like, yeah. And then like we got into it. He was like, my dad would just like stay in bed for days at a time, and my mom would just be like, oh, he's just tired. He needs his rest. And I was like, and I would just like kept like bringing more and more out of him. And after we were done, I was like, everything we just did, basically what you do in therapy. And I was like, but we were just talking. But do you feel better after talking? And I was like, I feel kind of weird, but yeah, better. I was like, this is it. That's therapy. Um, I will say, I believe we are seeing like a big shift in the cultural
Mhm.
zeitgeist of it.
Yeah. Yep.
These young folks, they seem super into it.
If you're enjoying the podcast so far, please hit the subscribe button and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us to reach more men and inspire them to become the best versions of themselves. Thank you for your support. And now back to the show. Yeah, Generation Z is really emotionally intelligent. And I thought like I was emotionally intelligent as a millennial, and it's like not even close. I mean, these kids are like real, real into it, which is
Hmm.
cool, And I think they're down. They don't have the same like, at least they don't seem to have the same ego that I did growing up, where they seem like open to ask for help a little bit
Yeah.
more. And I think they're getting a lot more mental health education, even if it's through, it's non-ideal, right? Through like TikTok or Instagram or things like that. But like, I didn't
Yeah.
have any of that. Like I
No.
had a bunch of like nerds on the internet trying to parent ourselves, and we got some real fucked up ideas
Yeah.
about the world. So I'm happy that they're at least getting like some kind of mental health education as they're growing up.
Hmm.
So I wanted to pivot a little bit to your topic. So you're presenting on the conference on machismo. So
Yes.
I'm curious for the listeners if you could define machismo and specifically how it differs from masculinity here.
Sure. So it's not necessarily that it's going to differ all that much.
Okay.
I put it akin to it's all pizza, it just has different toppings.
Pleasure.
I'm gonna regret that because now I want pizza. Um, but like the toxic masculinity in the training, I break it down into these like three tenets of it. Before I cover the shit, so like I'll just be upfront. In all the times I've searched for it, I can't find a single functioning definition for toxic masculinity. Like there doesn't seem to be like anything that everybody agrees on as like yes that's it, that's how we're going to define it perfectly. But there do seem to be some things, some elements that everyone agrees are part of toxic masculinity. One is the idea of like power and dominance, where you know you have to use whatever tools you have at your disposal to obtain power, to be a dominant figure in whatever space you're in. And in this more capitalistic society that we live in, power is attained through financial success, financial status, these kinds of things. So this is kind of the part of masculinity that tells men your only worth comes from whatever kind of good or service you can provide. This one particular internet joke that I honestly, the first time I ever remember seeing it, I think I was in either coming out of middle school or going into high school, somewhere in that age range, and it just basically said only women, children, and dogs are loved unconditionally. Men are only loved for what they can provide. Um, and I saw it way back then in like 2002 or something, and I saw it again sometime right after or right in the midst of the pandemic. Like that same joke just came back,
Okay.
and it never truly leaves the zeitgeist. That this one fucking idea that men need to earn their worth or their value. Right now, the big term that's spreading around the internet is high value man. And, a high value man is consistently someone who's in really good shape, and making a lot of money. Like, we can't have, like, in this train of thought, a man can't have value unless he's earning it in some way or shape or form. So that's like that one tenet of
Yes.
the toxic masculinity, is that power and dominance issue. Then next is toughness. You know, men have to be tough, tough it out. We have to be self-reliant. We're not allowed to ask for help. We're not allowed to have overt emotional expression, except for anger. But anger is not an emotion; it's a tool that you can use to achieve power and dominance. Um, so if you are overwhelmed, no, you're not. You're just tired. You just need a nap. If you're depressed, no, you're just tired. Don't worry about it. None of these things, like these feelings, don't exist. Feelings aren't masculine. You have to be tough, and that's the second tenet. And then the last one is to be anti-feminine.
Okay.
Everything that isn't overtly masculine is feminine, so it's bad. Honestly, you can summarize it to just saying feminine, bad, masculine, good, and if not masculine, then feminine. So, speaking your feelings, feminine equals bad. Being flamboyant, feminine, bad. Wearing too many colors, feminine, bad. And these three ideas of like power, dominance, toughness, anti-feminine, we see these expressed in almost every culture that struggles with, that has like even a concept of masculinity. The training that I did, Machismo, I labeled it Machismo just because, Mexican culture is the one that I have the most experience in working with. But I labeled it Machismo because, unfortunately, sometimes the toxicity of masculinity is deeply ingrained into culture, into our cultural identity. As I was saying earlier, the good old boys from the South, like their masculinity is deeply ingrained into their culture. We hear it in country songs. We can see it in rodeos, even beer commercials, truck commercials. A lot of them are selling this idea where, like, if you buy this truck, you're more masculine, and that's a good thing. In Mexico, there's a similar idea, the concept of machismo, where your maleness gives you some kind of value, some kind of worth, and you get to use that to oppress women specifically. So we see it in so many different cultures, and it is deeply ingrained in a lot of cultures. If we include religion in cultures, Judeo-Christian teachings do unfortunately have a lot of elements into them that follow some of these aspects of toxic masculinity. And in doing the work of trying to heal with men, in men trying to heal, we have to find a balance between challenging the toxicity, challenging the harm, and not dismissing the heritage, not dismissing the culture. As an example, one that comes up both in this country and in Mexico a lot. Certain Judeo-Christian teachings say that man is the head of the household, as God is the head of the church. And essentially trying to tell men that they must be dominant within their households, that their female spouses must be submissive to them. And this is something that we also see in several Islamic teachings and Islamic traditions. So I don't know if you've ever if you've ever counseled somebody in issues that might like butt up against their religious beliefs,
Mhm.
but I mean, you're nodding yes, I assume yeah, but like
Yeah.
yeah, if if the counseling is butting up against their religious beliefs, more often than not, they're going to hold on to their religious beliefs, and that's fine. I'm not going to argue against someone's religion. Um, your faith is your faith, and that's excellent. So the point of the machismo was challenging the toxicity while honoring the culture and the heritage.
Yeah, totally. I think that's really well said. There's a lot of good stuff you said there, but I'll just, riff on that last point where,
Yeah,
yeah, I think I'm developing this, right? Because I think a lot of the guys want those toxic masculine components, right? And it's like our job to, I guess, both like validate that and start to over time, very, very slowly, like poke holes in it, you know?
yeah,
And I found it's helpful to do like minor shifts, right? So like, okay, instead of being a warrior, you're a protector, instead of like being dominating, you're initiating, because I think those like
yeah.
little shifts are actually quite powerful for guys because I do think they want like we want to be strong and we want to be tough,
Hmm.
right? And
Yeah,
it goes back to your third point, which I certainly got a lot of growing up, and I imagine most guys did, which is the anti-feminine piece. I talk about with my guys as like having a negative personality. We're told like don't be this, right? Don't be weak, don't be emotional, don't be soft. It's all don't, but we rarely
yeah.
get like what to do, you know?
Hmm.
And like that is just, I think, like pretty objectively just like a very flimsy character structure if it's all just based on what not to do, but doesn't have any kind of like self core. Um,
Yeah,
so I guess going back to that point, I'm curious, and I'll share where I believe. Do you believe that there are like actual gender differences? Because I do believe that like there are genders between male and female and biological differences. But I'm
yeah.
wondering what your views are on that.
So I hold the view that yes, there's undeniably physiological differences between people with XX chromosomes, XY chromosomes, um, XXY, XYY, the X with a little bit of Y. You know, the the physiological difference is undeniable.
There's
Um, People with XY chromosomes, yeah, tend to have beards, upper body strength, or I guess more upper body strength.
like,
Uh, People with double X chromosomes, mammary glands, periods, ovaries. Um, Not everybody. There are people who don't. Um, so I do believe in the physiological differences. I believe that the social differences are ones that we have. I mean, they're social differences. We created them. Um, do young women, like, young children, often prefer to play slightly more gendered games? Yeah, it happens. Absolutely. Sometimes it's because they watch and they're mimicking. Um, Sometimes it's an inherent thing. I remember not that long ago, um, this one particular little girl whose favorite toy in the world when she was 4 through 6 years old was a garbage truck
yes,
that was like light blue and purple colors. That was her favorite toy in the world, garbage truck. And I was like, why not? Garbage trucks are cool. They make a lot of loud noise. They're big. They're loud. There's lots of love. Uh, and I think that's excellent. If
Yep.
people feel pulled to following the more like social norms associated to gender, wonderful. Go for it. If they feel like going against the social norms of gender, also wonderful. Go for it. There are differences.
Yeah.
There just are. The people who on either side who want to say there aren't any differences, I'm sorry, there are. Um, it might be because we were raised to believe that the differences exist, maybe, in which case it becomes a self fulfilling prophecy where the differences only exist because we believe that they exist. Doesn't stop us from believing that they exist.
Right. Yeah. And I think for like the average therapy user, they're not going to totally dismantle like a massive cultural,
Hmm.
like implant, right? Like
Yeah.
maybe someone that is really devoting their life to overcoming that. But I do believe for most people, it's like they're in these camps, you know?
Yeah, of course. Absolutely. So, like, I enjoy getting manicures and painting my nails. I haven't done it because I don't know a good place to do it where I live now. Um, but like, I'll admit it, the first several times I did it, I still felt a little bit off. Like
Yeah.
I felt like people were going to judge me.
Mhm.
And ultimately, that's where I believe the problem exists in this whole like gendered dynamic thing. Like, gender differences are a thing,
Mhm.
and they're a social construct. I feel it's really only harmful when when people don't feel allowed to be their authentic selves because they're afraid of going against the norm.
Okay.
I'm not against having a norm. Norms are fine. They're going to happen. Just when you have enough of any one thing, it's going to become the norm. The problem becomes when people feel they can't go against it without some kind of repercussions. And what we know is that the repercussions are very real.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. I'd say I agree with that, right? Like, I'm basically like pro-choice everything, you know? So it's like, I think, yeah, having the choice, having options is what's really critical there, and
Yeah.
having like acceptance, I guess, ideally, but at the very least, I think like tolerance and hopefully curiosity, right? I think that's maybe
Oh,
we can
yeah, that's a good one.
work there, as to like why people making different choices, right? At least you'd be a little bit curious, and just tolerate them.
Yeah.
So I think that is critical. And I think it's like, I talk with my guys, it's about having like the toolbox, and being a master at each tool. And sometimes
Hmm.
you have a tool that might like, be labeled a feminine tool, but it's important to be able to use that tool and not be stuck like just being the hammer, just having
Yeah.
one thing, which I think for a lot of guys it is. And you've mentioned it. You've mentioned anger a lot during this conversation. I think for most guys, that's what it is. It's like,
Hmm.
it's just that anger hammer. And like, we just whip it out to solve everything. And I think because of, oppression dynamics, it actually works a lot. Like I
Yeah.
think a lot of people are really afraid of masculine anger and don't know how to actually lean into it. Like you talked about with that counselor that spoke with you, that was curious about your anger, right? I
Hmm.
think most people just either flinch at male anger or just like get out of the way. So it seems
Yeah.
effective, in the short term. In the long term, it's not, because
Yeah.
that man is not being understood. He probably isn't getting really what he wants. He's probably lost respect. I like that you brought up, when you get angry, you lose. So I think that's true in American culture too, of like, if you lose your shit, you're still feminine, right? Like you're still emotional. You
He's
still
so
can't like
emotional.
contain it. Yeah, right. It's like someone who can't handle their drinks or whatever, right? Like I think that there is like a respect penalty that
Yeah,
gets paid there, you know.
absolutely. And uh, so oh man, there's this idea that masculinity is something. There's a term for it, and I'm just blanking on what it is right now. But there's this idea that masculinity is something we have to earn.
Mhm.
Like respect. Like you have to earn your place in being masculine, and you have to do it in a very visible space. And unfortunately, men who don't know that there's other tools outside of anger will just be like, well, it's worked for me in the past. Like you said, it's not actually working. People are just getting out of your way. So I'm just gonna keep keep on this anger train. Like it worked when I was a teenager. Clearly it's gonna work now that I'm 30 and working at some kind of white collar job in an office.
Yeah.
The
Oh, I'm
well, I was
curious.
gonna say,
I
the harm.
want to dive into that with you because I think I'm curious we may differ there, because at least the word that I use is like initiation, right? You have to be like
Okay.
initiated, and I do believe that. I do believe that like from boy to man, there has to be this initiation process.
Hmm.
I think I differ in that like it doesn't have to be super public, right? But I do think there is this like prove yourself to yourself kind of thing
Okay.
that I believe that boys have to go through. And I think like for some guys, it's in the physical realm, in the traditional masculine realm. For some other people, it might be in the spiritual realm or in the emotional realm, or wanting to travel the world or wanting to do something,
Hmm.
right? And when I work with young guys, they carry so much shame. So when I use this kind of like prove yourself to yourself metaphor, this idea, right? It's like having a guy do something where they feel like a man, if that makes sense, or something where they're
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
proud, like really proud of something,
Hmm.
whether it be an accomplishment or a relationship or again, a vacation or a adventure. But I do believe men need that. It's kind of like a hero journey type of
Absolutely.
thing. I think we need to feel like we've like slayed a dragon, to feel like we fit in. But yeah, I'm curious of what you think about that.
No, I agree completely. That sounds excellent.
Yeah.
Uh, I I would love it if everybody could could come at it with that kind of mentality of it doesn't necessarily matter what the thing you overcame was, so long as at the end of it you feel that sense of accomplishment. You
Yeah.
feel like you slew your dragon. Um, what was it? Like somebody was telling me like, oh yeah, most of the founding fathers were in their like mid 20s when they did all the things that we write
Yeah.
about them for. And I was like,
Yeah.
in my mid 20s, I wasn't doing shit.
I wasn't
I
founding a
was,
country. Tell you right now.
yeah, I was no, I was overcoming my own demons, and that
Yeah.
was fun. But like, no one's gonna write a book about it. I'm not gonna wind up on history books because of it. So I like that. I really like that idea of, you know, slay your own dragon. Very much hero's journey. Excellent.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Because I think that is critical, and I think like when I see at least guys in the millennial generation, I say this as I could have been one of these guys, right? That I think like stay very isolated, stay online a lot,
Hmm.
don't challenge themselves. I think it's very easy to live a comfortable life,
Oh
and
yeah.
a life without challenge. But like when I was in that, it just like degraded my self esteem.
Oh yeah.
And like my belief is that I think there is something masculine to seeking and overcoming challenge as a way of growth.
Absolutely.
Kind of a
Yeah.
pocket phrase I have is I think men grow through challenge and I think women grow through relationship. I think they really grow through connection with each other and growing and using each other as mirrors. Whereas where I see men, it's like the relationship is in service of the challenge. It's like using other people as mirrors so that we can overcome what we're doing and
That
growing.
man. So that mirrors particularly my earlier friendships with men.
Okay.
Uh,
Yeah.
uh, in my, well, let's say earlier to mid 20s, if I had friendships with men, most of them were very much like competition based, like
Yeah.
constantly pushing each other to do better, push harder, be faster. Uh, with one guy, he was a wonderful friend. We did like a lot of like extreme camping and survivalist stuff. And like with another dude, it was like going to the gym, like lifting heavy and moving stuff. A couple guys from like my boxing gym. Most of my friendships with guys were very much like based on like pushing each other
Yeah.
to do more. Uh, I will say though, I found a lot more satisfaction in my life in pursuing relationships, friendships, like platonic relationships with women, where I felt that the connection was the more important
Was the
aspect.
focus. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I do agree that right now, you know, men do often feel this idea that like we have to do stuff to achieve. We have to push. We have to
Brother.
be more, be stronger, be faster. Uh, wouldn't it be wonderful if we all had the opportunity to also grow through connection,
I'll see.
uh, where we were allowed to believe that like the dragon we slew was, like you said, getting out of that internet safe space
Mhm.
and connecting with others. Because man, those internet echo chambers will absolutely drag you down and hold you there and tell you you're fine and that the rest of the world is wrong. Um,
Yep.
by like growing through connections with people through that human interaction, that's honestly where I felt my real accomplishment come from.
Yeah.
I'm relatively accomplished, competitive boxer throughout I was 17, got to like district finals, did pretty well. I'm still
Mhm.
physically in good enough shape. Professionally, I'm achieving what I want to achieve.
Nice.
Um, but like for me personally, my my dragon was no less, I don't know how to phrase this, uh, not letting go of my anger, but not letting my anger stop me from developing relationships. Um, I I was also a pretty solitary kid. You know, I had my 3 or 4 nerd friends, and we were pretty insulated from the rest of the world. Um, but developing connections, developing relationships, man, that was my that was my hill to climb.
Totally, totally, right. I don't think you're alone in that. Like, I mean, I've struggled with that. I know a lot of dudes struggle with that, right? Like, being able to actually connect and like
Mhm.
actually feel something is
Yeah.
huge,
Mhm.
right? And like in many ways, that's like harder than running a marathon, man. I mean,
Oh my
because you have to
God,
do
yeah.
so much deep emotional work and you have to actually be open to the present moment. I mean, I had to study Buddhism for freaking 3 years to like feel anything. I was like really shut down as a
Awesome.
kid and as a young adult. And I can go back there sometimes and get depressed and dissociate and
Yeah.
all that stuff, right? But yeah, I had to like actively train mindfulness of like sit down, shut up, and try to feel anything. Because back to kind of the idea of toxic masculinity that you were speaking about, right? Like I think our apertures are so small as
Hmm.
men, and it's one of those things is like, it's for good reason, right? Like we don't want to feel bad, right? But
Hmm.
like in not feeling bad, we also don't feel good. And then we just feel like automatons. And the only thing that we can get is just what you were saying is like that provider aspect of like,
Yeah.
okay, because I don't feel anything because I'm not connected. Oh no, I got like a cool car, like I got a house in like a cool area,
Hmm.
like check out the six pack. But most guys that even have those accomplishments, they feel very tight to me,
Yeah.
because there's no emotional like anchor with any of that.
Yeah. And then it's all very much uh, these like high value guys. Um, it's very performative,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
if if they don't have all that flash, then people will start to realize, hey, this is possibly someone who hasn't developed a lot of substance. Um, and good for them. If you have the 6 pack abs, I'm jealous because I've never had and probably never will. And you have the 6 figure income and the flashy car. Absolutely,
um,
that's usually obtained through no small degree of effort,
yeah,
uh, and that deserves recognition. Maybe we also aim for some human connection, some emotional vulnerability. I mean, the car is nice, absolutely, but like, do you have people that you actually enjoy spending time with riding in that car with you? Um, so it's a it's a challenge for a lot of us
yeah,
to be okay with having human connection be the important thing.
totally.
Uh,
Yeah, and I think
the
building emotional intelligence to talk about the path. Like
Yeah.
I also respect dudes that are jacked, right? And there are some in my life that I think the culture is really shifting, but there are some that can talk about like the discipline, for instance, that's
Hmm.
required to get there, right? Or like, waking up on a day they didn't want to go to the gym and making it happen, or having like the mindfulness to track calories and try to eat healthy, right? Like the
Oh yeah.
process, I think like is really cool. But I,
Yeah.
I do think like as men, we're conditioned to focus only on the outcomes. And we're like,
Hmm.
hey, look at my six pack. When I think really we want to be recognized for all those things I just mentioned, right? The discipline, the intelligence, the
Hmm.
the knowledge, right? The sacrifice. Like these are, I think, like very traditional masculine values, but it gets shrunk down to like, hey, look at how much I can bench, you know? And then when people are like, okay, yeah, whatever, dude. It's like, but I think guys feel let down because they don't, we're not sharing the full story. We're not sharing
Hmm.
like the whole saga. We're just focusing on like the number at the end.
Yeah. And the saga's the important part.
Yeah.
Like
Right.
this, you know, it's great when Frodo throws the ring into Mount Doom, but like there's so much more to the story.
Yeah.
Like that's the better part.
Right.
But yeah, no, I agree. It's about results, not about how we get there. And
Yeah.
maybe we spend some time recognizing the journey,
No, absolutely.
the hero's journey. Haha.
There it is. We're back. So as we're near the end of the show here, I'm curious, like, I guess maybe two questions, right? It's like one,
Sure.
where do you see masculinity going? Because I think that it is changing seemingly
Hmm.
quite rapidly right now. And two, this could
Yes.
be the same answer. Like, where would you like it to go? You know, if you could
Oh,
just like, how do you think it should change, or what do you think masculinity might look
okay.
like, call it like 10, 15, 20 years out?
Yeah. So, so, masculinity changing is a feature of masculinity.
Right?
Masculinity has always had deep historical and cultural contexts. Um, I would love for masculinity to be redefined as one where it's into a definition that is very inclusive, and by that I mean like it's not restrictive.
I know.
Where if you want to wear nail polish, it's masculine. If you want to have a very traditional appearance, it's masculine. Where like regardless of what you're choosing to present, it can be seen as masculine. And one where we encourage, yes, achievement, because recognizing achievement is important, but also recognize the journey that you went to the achievement
Right.
and encourage human connection within that. You know, achievements can be absolutely, I worked really hard and I bought a car, but achievements, we should also encourage, I worked really hard on myself and now I have like friends that I enjoy spending time with, even if all we do is sit and talk about how we've been for the last, whatever amount of
Mhm.
time. So encouraging connection, removing the restrictions on the definition, on like, yeah, removing the restrictedness of the definition. Um, Man, the more I'm talking, the more I'm realizing it's like, it, maybe this is my ultimate goal. Sorry, I'm just coming to this like conclude. I'm just coming to this realization. I guess if I'm really being honest, I would really like it if masculinity and femininity essentially became somewhat indistinguishable.
I don't know.
Um, because I can't imagine a definition of masculinity that is mechanically different from femininity outside of physiological changes or physiological differences. Because yeah, in my mind, the ideal thing would be one where we encourage connection, encourage relationships, encourage achievement and recognition, uh, empathy, emotional acceptance and awareness. And I was like, when I put all that together, I I have a hard time differentiating it from what femininity might be defined as well.
Yeah.
Like it just seems so open and vague that it can mean almost anything.
Yeah, so mostly you're like a focus on the individual, right? Maybe a removal of labels completely and a focus on the individual and just being like, hey,
That
like,
would
who
be
are
nice.
you? What's your self expression of being
Yeah,
human? And yeah, you belong, right? Like this idea of like belonging in the community of men just for who you are, you know, not because you
yeah,
have to like meet some kind of standard or check off a certain number of boxes or something.
that sounds excellent. Yeah, that's a much more cohesive way to say it than what I did.
Let's go with that one. Okay. Awesome. Awesome. Well, it was phenomenal to have you on the show. I'm sure I'll have you on the show again in the future. Can you let people know if they want to learn more about you or work with you? How can they find you online?
Sure, thank you, Mark. So you can find me at treeoflifecounselingcenter.org. That is the email, or that is the website directly associated to the company that I'm working with. You can also find me on Psychology Today, because like almost every therapist I've ever known has a Psychology Today. Uh, we Tree of Life Counseling Center has an Instagram page. That's honestly where I post more often than not. We have YouTube and other stuff, but like Instagram just seems to be where we get the most interaction. So that's where it's most easy to find me and my delightful colleagues, all of us doing this same kind of work to disrupt some of the systems that might be oppressive at this point.
Huh? Awesome. Well, all that stuff will be in the show notes. So you definitely give them a follow, check out the website, and reach out and work with them. I mean, I think he's a phenomenal therapist, and you would do well to reach out. So thank you so much for joining us again. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. If you find this episode helpful, please share it with someone that's looking for a more expansive definition of masculinity, someone that maybe you feel like needs to hear what we're talking about and get, I guess, like permission in a way, right? To like break outside the box and have a more unique experience of being alive and being human. Send it their way. And of course, like, comment, subscribe, do all this stuff. And we will see you next week in another episode of the Men's Therapy Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and leave a review. And don't forget to visit menstherapy.online to learn more about the work that we are doing to support and inspire men. Until next time, keep moving forward.